everybody, and welcome to GenFriends. I'm your host, Cheri Hudson Passey from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and I've got a fabulous, fabulous panel. I love when these ladies and I get together and talk genealogy. We've got Melissa Barker, our archive lady. Hi, Melissa.
Hello.
How you doing back there in your archives?
Doing good, doing good.
Good. We have got Laura Hedgecock from Treasure Chest of Memories. Hi, Laura.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. So glad you're here. We've got Mary Kircher Roddy from MKR Genealogy. Hi, Mary.
Hi there.
Mary's still in Ireland. Please behind
maybe
her.
If I see it often enough, it will actually happen.
There you go.
I want to go too, Mary. Don't leave without me. I want to go.
It's like your vision board, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then, of course, we've got Shelley Murphy, our family tree girl, is here. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
In her mountain home. In your mountain home in Virginia.
Yes, the Blue Ridge Mountains, definitely.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. Well, sorry. We are going to talk about finding your roots. Season 8 has started, and we've got to play a little catch up here. We've had some other things going on. I was virtually out of town, and we've had people sick and weather issues and things like that. So we need to catch up with the first 3 episodes of season 8. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about the things that were going on, the family stories that were found, the records that were found, and try to help. I mean, it's fun to watch, right? But we also need to watch it in a way that helps us to be able to move forward with our family history. There are ideas and tips as you see the records that they're looking at for these families. Maybe you've never thought of looking in specific places before, or the way they put things together. So watch these genealogy TV shows and try to see if you can't pick up your own tips and hints. We are going to start with episode 1. Since we got 3 to go to, we're going to start with episode 1. And it featured Lee Daniels, who's a producer, and Rebecca Hall, who is an actress. She's a British actress with an American mother, and or is an American father and a British mother. I think that's what it
American
was.
mother.
Yeah,
and her father was British.
That's right. It had to be that way. Yes, the story to take place. We've got all these stories in our heads from all these episodes. So
they're gonna all come together.
We're all gonna come together. We're gonna have one story go, no.
Yeah,
all didn't happen to that one person, right? So I know Melissa, that you wanted to talk a little bit about this episode. I thought it was interesting how it started. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about Lee first or Rebecca first. Which one would you like to start with?
At this point, I remember Rebecca's story more than I do Lee. So if someone else remembers Lee's better, they can chime in. Yeah. Rebecca Hall was very interesting to me. I've recently been part of some book clubs and done some reading of some books about passing and about some of the things that's happened back in the Jim Crow era. And so it was very interesting to me. And especially the fact is that her mother is American. Her mother told her kind of off and on and during her life that there was something in the background, and then she would maybe say that maybe she had African American, and then didn't really say. And so she was very interested in wanting to know, which don't we all want to know when we have these stories that we don't know the full truth, or we have stories trying to figure out if they're all true. And so, but how she came about to find out the truth was quite interesting. Because it's something that I teach genealogists as well, as far as African Americans and Native Americans, and how during a certain period of time, people would rather have been known as one race or to the other, because at certain periods of time, one was disliked more than the other. And so what happened was, with her father, he actually married a Sioux woman who's Native American, but he started passing himself off as Native American when he was not. In fact, he used to travel with the show and do shows and talk about the big Sioux. Yes, but he really was African American. He was Black. And so, today I think a lot of us would be upset maybe if we were part of the Native American race, or maybe the African American race, but then, I left kind of asking the question, why did the Sioux Nation, because they knew he wasn't, because they showed a record where it showed that he wasn't. Why did they allow him to do that? Or did they even have any control?
Right. I had that question too. And all I can think about is perhaps the story had been told so many times that people just start believing the story. It was in the newspaper. The newspaper printed that he was a chief, where he would go and perform, all these different, they had a whole story about where he was born and that he was raised on that. Nobody just looked into it. I suppose nobody questioned it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but the Sioux Nation knew. That's the thing.
You would think.
But at the time, you have to remember too that they were not looked upon very favorably. So maybe they just were glad that he was promoting.
It could be
their nation as being.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be. But then when you find out who his father was. And you ask yourself the question, well, why would he do this? I mean, look at his father. He was famous. He was in Washington, D.C. He was known. He was, and I'm like, well, why would he leave that and go do this? But that didn't get answered either.
But,
people
pass, and I can only speak from the African American, and I also could speak from the Native American, thinking in my own family, and I remember we were introducing cousins at a cemetery and introducing, saying, these were white cousins, and they were being introduced to who was their second great grandfather, which they didn't know was African American. They were told he was Indian. And so they had a little bit of anger. And again, they're white, raised white, the whole 9 yards. And I remember my mother saying, stop, because they start questioning. And again, we took them to the family cemetery, and she said, you don't know what they had to go through. And so, and I remember it was Lester Marsh and his wife. And Lester Marsh's daddy is Warren Marsh, same thing. My second great grandfather, these are his kids. But anyway, what had happened, he had passed him, Lester, I believe, was passing himself off as Native American and not African American. And she said people had to survive.
Right.
And it wasn't as nice and friendly for that wife to marry, or that woman to marry that African American, but it was better to marry the Indian at that time and where they were at.
Right.
And so he was
I thought about
as Indian. And again, so she said, don't judge.
Don't judge
because you don't know what happened and why.
Right. What I thought was really interesting about this episode is, he was pulling up all these newspaper accounts about how he was going on these shows. And they had his whole story about his life, where he was born, where, right on the Indian reservation, it said, and all the stuff about him. Yeah. And of course they proved that to not be true. But then when they found the newspaper article about his father, who, the first thing they said was, but this one's true. So that just goes to tell you, goes to show you that no matter what you find, you've got to prove it. You can't even, things even printed up in the newspaper like that, you would think that something like that would have been true, that he, was a chief, that, all these things.
Newspapers, I would say, are just notorious for just random errors that they don't understand. And so they hear half the thing and write the words of a sentence that they didn't get the other part of it. So so between just that carelessness in reporting that was just endemic, and I think they're better fact checkers now. I don't think there were any fact checkers in 1990.
But we're still seeing some of the same stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
seriously.
true. That's true.
Yeah.
But
And
we
we're
that
won't
is
get
true.
into the
seeing some of
politics.
that. 'cause
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
of
Well,
Yeah.
getting that news
yeah, we
out
won't-
there.
right.
Yeah.
We won't
But-
get into that. But
Yeah, but then
Right,
But I'm-
if someone is trying to deceive
Sure.
or shape
Sure.
the story
yeah.
for their own personal means, for whatever
Yeah.
reason they had,
wasn't
then
there
we
a
get that
couple
too.
that faked being Indian and went around and did shows and stuff? I'm gonna have to find that information. There was a
You'll have to
couple.
find that out. Well,
No,
what I
I'm
thought was
just
interesting
thinking
too.
of that when she
Yeah.
said random and what Mary commented on, and
Mhm.
I thought, wait a minute, there was a couple that did this. A couple
Oh,
that
I'm
did
sure
the
there were a
same
lot of people
thing,
that did that.
passed
Yeah.
as Native American, and they
Right.
weren't,
Yep.
and then they got busted,
Yeah.
basically. And
And
stuff.
you know,
But you
we've
know
got
what?
a
What was
lot of
the
stories,
advantage?
Shelley. We've got a lot of stories, I think, in our family history
Yeah.
that we take, even if we find that it's in the newspaper or something like that, if we just leave it and we don't research those
Or it
stories
gets
that we're
messed
finding,
up.
all of our trees are going to have these stories. No wonder everybody thinks you've got an Indian princess or and your
Yeah.
line is because this is what happens. But you know, I think also she was so thrilled that they figured that out. At first she was so happy you could see, oh, he was a chief and he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn and all these things.
Oh God.
Yeah.
And then they started throwing documents at her. Look at this. Every time he signs something, he signs it different. And then they were able to find his family, and that cinched it, you know, with them being mulatto.
Well, his
Yeah.
Social Security application was what gave it away, mainly because it said really where he was born.
Yes,
He was
that's
born
right,
in
in
Virginia.
DC. Oh no,
Was it DC
sorry,
or Virginia?
it was no, you're
No,
right. It was Virginia, but
Virginia.
then his
Yeah.
other record said DC. Yeah, you're
But
right.
one aspect of her story, which is a period that that fascinates me, and one that I wish genealogists would study more, is the time
Mhm.
period from the end of the Civil War to the Jim Crow era, because that's the Reconstruction era. And
Yeah.
when you read and when you watch documentaries and things about that era for the African Americans, you would be absolutely amazed at the progress that they were able to make during Reconstruction, and then
Exactly.
it slams down, you know, when
Exactly.
Jim Crow
Just
starts.
shuts. It just
It
completely
does.
shuts
And
down on
so
them. You're
that's
right.
why I encourage researchers who have African American ancestry to look at that time period very closely for your ancestors, to see, just like her great grandfather, what all he was, you know.
Right.
But then soon after, when it all started coming down, it wasn't
Yeah.
good.
It wasn't
One of
good.
the things that another thing about Rebecca Hall too that was very fascinating, she was a British actress.
Yes.
And they found that she had a Revolutionary War patriot on her side, and so they asked her, so what do you think about that, you know, because being British, and so she kind of laughed.
But he was
about
on the
that.
opposite side,
Yes,
wasn't he? He was on the continental side, not
that's
on
why he was
the
a
loyalist
patriot.
side.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
a patriot. Yeah.
Not a
And here
loyalist.
she is.
no,
Yeah, and here she is. Here she is British. I thought that was really funny too. And also they found a whole line that she had free people of color, and they got all the way back to the 1700s with a name and, you know, a family and all that kind of stuff. And so she had some really interesting things going on. Really interesting things going on.
She
Yeah,
did.
Laura.
One thing I just wanted to know, one of you just said that Dr. Gates said, how did you feel about that?
Mm-hmm.
I noticed he does that. He always leaves it really open. How do you feel about that? And he never indicates in any way that the way they feel is not right. Which I think is
That's
Either
true.
way.
it's
Yeah.
a good tip for those of us interviewing relatives, and especially as we're getting into kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it really invites that deeper conversation, and it's really a non-confrontational way to go about it. So I've been noticing that about him, and whatever they say, he goes,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
yeah, you know, he
Yeah.
just bring it on, keep going, keep telling me
Yeah.
what's on your mind. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good tip for all of us.
Yeah.
I agree.
Now,
Go
on
ahead,
Lee
Melissa.
Daniels, I don't remember, I remember more of Rebecca's than I do of Lee, but I do remember one thing about Lee, is that his mother used an address of a wealthy acquaintance. And so he could go to school, go to a better school. Yeah.
Didn't she go to jail for that or got arrested? What was that?
No.
She got in trouble. I thought she got for.
No, I don't think so.
No, that's what happens now.
No, she did not. And then of course, and Gates made the comment. He said, "Well, that happens a lot. That people do that." And so, and I agree, because, like I said, I've been reading some books and things about that. But there's a couple of quotes that, a couple of quotes that I thought were really good. And I don't remember who said them. It was either Lee or Rebecca. Probably, I think it was Lee. He said, "Genealogy is a history that's personal." I really like that. And then the one that really got me is, he said, "Silences are passed down from one generation to the next."
Absolutely.
And then the last thing I'll say about episode 1, we can go to another one, is I wrote this down because it's what I really got out of this one, is that this episode is the reasons why we have to understand our ancestors' time period.
Yes.
When our ancestors lived. We cannot take them out of their time period and put them in ours or anywhere else. And so that this particular episode really gave me the sense of that. And so that's kind of what I got out of episode 1.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because we're even dealing, and again, with talking about, say, 21st century, trying to understand what's going on back there. And I think it's an excellent point that you're making, and actually Dr. Gates as well. But look at the records that they were finding and the tracking that they did to find this information. And you made the suggestion that, for people to do that, but it's not always evident that they have or have not, until something comes up like DNA or something. We might not know, that somebody either passed or whatever we want to call it.
Think about his story, where they didn't know who the grandfather was. And then they did the DNA. And turns out that his grandfather had a child with 2 different women. One was a mother, one was a daughter. And
I
had
to back that tape back
and go, what now? And he says, no wonder nobody ever talked about it. And so that's another hard thing that we need to learn. There are going to be hard things, embarrassing things, bad things. There are going to be things that we find.
It didn't get passed down.
Yeah, that's why it didn't get passed down. But we need to understand that all of those things is what helps to form a family, and those things get passed down, and then that involves the children and how the children end up the way they are and what they're not going to pass down. And so all of those things are important to try to find out. But the only way they could find that one out would have been DNA, because there's no paper trail. And they were all living, except for the fact they were all living in one house. But who would have looked at that census record and say, I know? I mean, you never would have thought of that. So it was the DNA that crushed that case. So
yeah, because that might not have been talked about, discussed, but somebody, and a couple people in that household knew.
Somebody knew. I'm sure that somebody knew. So just filling in the holes. This one episode was just really filling in holes that they didn't know about, which, we've all got holes that we didn't know about. So we've all got stories that we didn't know about. The second episode was Anita Hill, and I don't know Brittany Cunningham. Once I introduced her and talked to her, it was great, but I didn't know of her before. And most of us in a certain generation know who Anita Hill is because of the Clarence Thomas confirmations. But they found some very interesting, wonderful things about their families that they didn't know. Now, Rebecca had no clue. Her dad never knew who his father was. They had a family story, right? You get the family story and you believe the family story, and their family story that came from her father was, I met my dad once out on the street, and he was drunk and he was walking around and he pointed to me and he said, that's my son. So that's the story that they were going on, right? Yeah. And maybe some drunk guy said that to him. I mean, who knows? Maybe some drunk guy did say that to him at one point. But as they are, and again, they had to go to DNA for this because they had no idea. And I liked how they introduced the fact that they took her DNA. Now, I am not a DNA expert, but I understand this. They took her DNA, they took her mom's DNA, and looked to see what the matches were. So the matches they could tell which matches were on the father's side versus the mother's side.
Subtract the mom's ones, and
they knew
you're
the
left with
mom's.
got to be the dad's side.
It's got to be the dad's, right? And so they figured out, okay, from who you're matching, this is your uncle or your dad's uncle. Sorry, your dad's uncle. So then they could go back a generation to figure out who his parents were.
Right.
They only had 2 sons. So therefore, the other brother was the father. So they were able to introduce a picture to her so she could see her grandfather for the first time. And then what I thought was really interesting is they then had to figure out, and I know that, Mary, you want to talk about this a little bit. How did you have to be able to get together?
Right. So when you have an unknown parentage situation, you have to place the mother and the father in the same location. And so often I think there is a bias that mom is here at conception. So dad, either he lived there or he was visiting. And so you could, his brother lived next door. So that's how he got there or whatever.
Right.
And I think we're always, I don't know, I think the bias is to tend to think that mom is there and dad has come from somewhere else.
I agree.
But in this situation, it wasn't that.
Wasn't that the Papa was a Rolling Stone from the
But the dad was firmly in Los Angeles and the mom was in Chicago, but she must have gone to LA, or very likely went to LA and had whatever kind of liaison, whatever extent it was, and whether dad ever knew that led to a conception.
And the reason they came up with that theory is, she's got siblings that live in that area of California. Aha.
Right.
That's how it happened. So that was interesting. And I just loved her face because she had never seen, she knew nothing about, I mean, she'd always just heard the story that my dad went out one day when he was about 6 years old and some man who was drunk said, "I'm your father." And so they had that's what the concept, of this man. And that's really what she said she wanted to find out by coming on the show. Can you find my grandfather?
Right.
And her father has passed away. So it's not like, she can now say, "Dad, I know who your dad is." But you can tell she was thrilled. But what's really interesting, what's really sad though about this case is that her grandfather was murdered by a jealous girlfriend.
Right.
But he'd had a child with his wife. He and his wife had a child. Okay. They then got divorced, but they had a child. And then that child had a child. So she's got a cousin.
Right.
And it was so funny because he said to her, "Did you ever think to yourself that you could have family connected to your dad's side?" And she's like, "It never crossed my mind." And so now she can contact them and learn a little bit more about her grandfather and then probably go back farther in that line since they found him. So I thought that was really, really special that they were able to do that and make that connection. I loved, and I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about Anita Hill's story, but her ancestors were actually able in Texas. Was it Texas? I believe in Texas.
Bowie County, Texas. That was the one thing about her story that I did not know, which everybody on this panel may have known, but me, was that there were 3 counties in all of the United States in the 1850 census that listed African slaves.
I did not know
their
that.
first name.
There is another county in another state, and I can't call it right now.
Well, they said Utah County, Scott County, Tennessee, and Bowie County, Texas.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've heard that before. I don't want to get into any whatever. Shelley, you may know a little bit more about this because you do more African American genealogy, but I don't know that the enumerators did that as any kind of political thing. I think they just did it. And they just, it's
Well,
like
I'd
every
look
other
at the
enumerator that
instructions
doesn't
and
read the
find out.
directions. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
No, it's almost like any other enumerator that just doesn't read the directions. And they probably went, oops.
Well, thank goodness they didn't read the directions.
I know, that's what I'm saying. But they kind of made it sound like on the show that they took a stand.
Oh, well.
And I don't know that that's, I mean, maybe they did. And how cool for
Well, I
them
don't
if they
know. The
did.
instructions told them not to log the names.
Right, I know. But
Right,
like we
but-
said,
And if they logged the names, they didn't follow the instructions that they
Yeah.
were hired to do.
well,
So you can
absolutely.
look
But
at
how
it
many-
that route. So
yeah,
maybe
how
they
many
were
times
taking
have
a
we-
stance. I don't
Right. And
know.
they could have been, but how many times have we seen that they
If I was a
didn't
descendant,
follow
that's what I'd
directions?
be telling them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I'm saying is we're throwing ideas on and we just don't know. We don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless we can find some other, paperwork
That's
or
genealogy
something.
right there.
Exactly. We would need to find something else to support that story.
But how
But,
amazing for that, because it's
Yeah.
always controversial. And I'm saying that using that word, especially
Yeah.
with Dr. Gates'
Yeah.
show, when they're looking at the slave schedules, 1850
Right.
and 1860.
Yeah.
And because there's not names and individuals are only identified by their age,
Right.
their
Yep.
sex or gender, and by their color. And I'm
Mhm.
not going to say race, but by their color.
By
'cause
their
they got
color, yeah.
Black, they got
Right.
mulatto, there could be all other,
Mhm.
other little
Right.
codes in there. But, and I think it's interesting that a numerator would do that.
Mhm.
And again, we can name 101 reasons why,
Mhm.
because that was actually a discussion, and I want to say it was a statesperson or representative
was
out
a
of
big-
South
yeah.
Carolina.
Yeah, it was a big, because whether
Big
they should do the
discussion,
names or
and
not.
he basically is saying, oh, the slaveholders can't keep up with all their slaves' names and whatever. It's not they don't need
Yeah.
it. And that was basically that conversation for
Right.
1850 and 1860. But
I
my
guess
goodness,
these
it
guys
would
didn't
help.
get the memo.
Correct.
Didn't get the
But it
memo.
would have helped
whatsoever.
so many people. But there
Yeah.
are, I just want the audience to know,
Yeah.
there are other records. Don't just
Sure.
rely as the
Yeah.
census. That is our
Ex-
number one as genealogists or family historians, is to go
Yeah.
to a census as a go-to, but they're also inaccurate a lot of times.
This is
And,
true.
and if you, after you've done this for several
This is
years,
true.
you can go from
Yeah.
census to census, you change race, and all of a sudden
Mhm.
you're not 10 years older, you're 20 years older.
Exactly. So
So
we
you don't
have
know
to
who
be,
gave the information.
we have to be really, really careful.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought it was interesting too that her ancestors, Anita Hill's ancestors, applied for a homestead. And that's not easy to do. And on top of that, their area where they applied for, where they had been living, there had been a race war going on. As a matter of fact, her ancestor's brother was killed because of this race war.
Yeah.
And yet
that
they
was
took a
an
stand and
interesting story.
they filed out that application, and they had that application to show her. How fun. I thought that was wonderful to be able to
Yeah.
show these documents to people as they were going through. But
And you know what
They
Anita
were
Hill
able-
said that got me, that really, she said,
Yeah.
he asked her how, one of those things, Laura,
yeah,
asked, how
Yeah.
do you feel? And she
Yeah.
says, I feel connected. And I thought,
Yeah,
don't we
I love
all
that.
feel that? Don't we
That
all
was
feel
nice.
connected?
exactly. That's what finding these stories and these documents do. They connect you to people that you didn't even know existed, and suddenly they become your friends because you're researching them and all that kind of
But
stuff.
even more than the connection, you find that, how do I say this? They were doing something. They weren't just back in
She's
1850.
yeah.
And
She
I'm not
said they're
talking about
real
color.
people.
But there
Yeah.
were actually people were owning houses, like you
Right.
said, land.
Yes.
They were
Exactly.
farmers. They were doing
Yeah.
this. They were doing that. The whole church part that people were
Right.
doing.
Yeah.
You're finding that they're actually real people.
Exactly.
Seriously.
And that's what
They
she
had
said. They're real
experiences
people.
and events that happen. And
Mhm.
that's the love of doing the research, is
Yeah.
finding out, compared to what we know now from our
Mhm.
experiences now, compared to what they have,
Right.
had back then. It's amazing. I mean,
Well,
there's no
I was
electricity.
thinking,
What would we can't make 1 or 2 days without getting a generation.
Exactly.
And I mean, to think about times back then and equating that. That's why it's dangerous with us in our 21st century.
I know.
Going back.
But you know, a lot of times when we watch these stories, we see, and we'll see more on the next one we do, but think about how tough they had to have been to decide,
Yes.
I'm going to get a
Survivors.
homestead and I'm going to make it work in this county where people hate us. But we're going to do it anyway. And they were able to do it, and they fought through, and they did quite well for quite a while. And then I'm thinking about the courage that Anita Hill had. And so I'm wondering if that courage was kind of passed down to her to be able to do some hard things. They did end up having to sell the land and move on, but they seem to have done well after that. So they weren't destitute, and they seem to have done well after they sold the land. And then of course the generations down to Anita Hill. So I liked her story, and I loved the fact that they were able to own the homestead, because we have talked about homesteading before, and so many people don't realize that African Americans could homestead. They just, people think they can't.
And you're talking
Another
about
cool thing.
1862 Homestead Act, May of 1862. Yeah.
Another cool thing was that she was able to find one of her ancestors had registered to vote.
Yes.
That was really cool. But they also had that really sad document where it was just a few years after the end of the Civil War. And there was a planter in their community who they were filing papers against because the names are in there, all the things that he had done to people. I mean, he had attacked her ancestor with a hoe. All the violence, but I can't imagine you come out of this culture that's violent against people. And I guess they just felt like they could just still continue to live in that way, and who was going to stop them? But at least we didn't know what happened. It didn't say did something happen after those papers were filed, but at least there was some recourse to try to file against them. So, but she got a lot of really good information.
I want to make a comment on the Homestead Act since Bernice is not here. The National Park Service a few years ago put out a book called Great Plains and the Black Homesteaders, and they partnered with Family Search and collected a bunch of stories, and they also have it up on their website right now, and that you can read stories and what they have been doing the last several months. And Bernice has a Facebook page called Black Homesteaders and things, and so she's helping people. It's a small group of us.
We should add that link. Yeah, we need to add the link.
Yeah,
we will. We'll add the link. We've used it before, but anytime, just in case nobody saw that one, we'll make sure we put it on this one.
There's stories on there of African Americans that owned or homesteaded from the May of 1862 Homestead Act. Don't look for Virginia, but look at the other states.
Is anybody, before we move on, thank you, Shelley. Before we move on to the third episode, does anybody have anything else they wanted to say about the Anita Hill, that episode? I just wanted to make sure. I think we covered everything, and I just love that they will show documents. So look at those documents they're showing, and think to yourself, could these documents ever have been created for my ancestors? There'll be things that I'm sure, I am sure there are a lot of, like we said, African-American researchers out there that don't have a clue to look in the Homestead Act, because I think we've got this in our heads. We just feel like they couldn't do anything, or women couldn't do anything, or, we get those things. And so we don't look at the records. Talking about women not being able to do anything. I really loved the one, this last one that they had where they called it Exiles, right? They called it Exiles because we had Raul Esparza. I'm gonna say his name right, Esparza, and he's an actor.
Yeah.
I've seen him in things. Yeah. And then they had a chef, David Chang, and his
Korean.
family, his family is from Korea, North and South Korea. And then Raul's family is from Cuba. And so
what I thought was really, really a great way to start the thing is just the trailer. They said these two people spent their entire lives wondering about places they'd never seen.
Right. Yeah. And I was going to say that you're exiled. Yeah. You don't know about these places.
So
you can't get to the
more
records.
than being an immigrant. I mean, it
yes.
means you can't go back.
Exactly, Laura. Yeah.
That just struck me. And then, of course, then the research is limited to family tradition because you can't go back, or, you know, a lot of the records at the time. So I thought this was just an incredibly interesting.
Me too.
On both sides. I think, that David Chang, his mother, had fled North Korea during, I think it was right before the Korean conflict, when China had taken possession of North Korea.
Yeah, I believe you're right. And apparently he said they lived in a castle. He says, my mom's family was rich. They lived in a castle. I've seen a picture of it.
And then he was talking about this complicated relationship that he has with his dad and with his grandmother.
Oh, the golfer.
They wanted him to be a golfer.
His dad wanted him to be a golfer.
Yeah.
I've got a question. When you talked about his grandmother, it actually, it's odd how different race of people, I guess, or ethnicities. I'm thinking of ethnicities. Have some similar things. When he was talking about his grandmother and how frugal she was because of what she'd come from, it reminded me of Depression era here.
Yes.
Because my husband's family lives in the South. My family lived in the North during the Depression. And it's so different. I talked to my husband's grandmother before she passed, and I asked her about the Depression, trying to get a first person, because she was born in the 1920s. And she said, she says, we really didn't know there was a Depression because we grew everything, or we raised everything.
Right.
We only had to buy 2 or 3 things. But when you talk to my family who lived in the cities in Akron, Ohio, and the North, they talk about how difficult it was and how hard it was. So they're talking about his grandmother. One thing I didn't quite understand, and somebody might can explain it to me, where she used to lay out the rice.
She was drying it.
But she said something about tea, and I thought, what does rice and tea have?
Maybe
any extra rice, and I think it was his example. It was just these grains of rice that even a few extra grains of rice couldn't be thrown away. And she had a process of re-drying them, and then she'd put them in tea. I guess,
or anything else that make them spread. Yeah.
I mean, if
that's frugal.
If you read about North Korea and later, so not when she was there, I mean, North Koreans truly starved. I mean, they were
still starving.
They were eating acorns and stuff. So it was almost like that, because I've seen that. I stayed in a Polish family where the mom, I think she just had PTSD from the Depression. She could not throw anything away. Anything.
And that's what he said about his grandmother. She would never throw anything away.
The thing was, it made me really sad. And this is what I don't know how we get around this. We grow up as children, and we have this frugal, angry, bitter woman as a grandmother, and we can't connect to her. And it's not.
He even said they made fun of her.
Yeah. Because they don't have this background. He said in their family, they did not talk. So not only did he not have any records, they didn't talk about it. So then with the maturity of adulthood and understanding her context, then he understands she was a product of her times.
Yes.
And that she's more, now to him, she's more of this heart-wrenching person.
I think he sees her as a hero now in some ways. And I think all of us could raise our hand and say, we knew family members that we didn't understand that we now understand.
Exactly. Because of what they went through. And Laura, he did say that was the way she showed us love. She was trying to protect us. And now as an adult, he can see that.
But it's
and
just
that got to me.
We look back and we say we missed that relationship. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just
Mhm.
hard. But it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, Cheri, about having to understand the context of that time.
Mm-hmm.
We just, in my lifetime, I can't understand that kind of hunger.
Oh yeah, no.
You know,
Right, because
no,
you've never been
absolutely.
in that situation.
Right.
Yeah.
right. I've never been, I mean, we live in this land of wasteful plenty, not just
There
Mhm.
we go. You
wasteful
said it
plenty.
correctly. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so, but then the thing that then just completely blew me away about his story was when it got to his father's side of the family, his father, the hustler. And then he found out, I don't want to give too much away because I think people should really watch this episode.
Yeah,
It's so interesting. But they found, and I don't know the correct pronunciation, but in Korea, there is this book of ancestry. And I wrote down Chokbo is the phonetic thing. That, I mean, and sitting with Dr. Gates, and I don't even know how long they sit there as they record the session. He went from knowing 2 generations to knowing 34 generations.
34 generations. That is amazing.
And then
that's also what Chinese do too.
Yeah,
right.
they do too.
And
Yeah,
you think
they
in
do.
the African cultures as well, you're right. It's the same premise, of course, different name, but they're doing the oral history of
and
generations.
I do think it's only the men ancestors, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't know.
But the other thing that was just so heartbreaking is his great grandfather had been in the US working and had ended up being really, it was this horrible situation due to this US hatred for Koreans while they were in Korea. It just,
because he come here because he was so smart. He was studying, he was in school, and then he got sick and they told him he had to go home, and he said, no, I'm not going to go home. Meanwhile, he's left his wife and child. And then he starts a new business with Asian gardens.
I love it. I love it.
He ended up in Cleveland, and he's like, what? I thought, this is the side of my family that's, hustling. I thought it was the other. And so, and then he finds out that he had a third great grandmother, somebody who came. No, that was the Cuban one. That was a Cuban story that she came up. Never mind. I'm getting my stories crossed. Anyhow, it's easy to do. But and then you know what he said? He said, I can now say that I'm proud of my family.
Yeah.
That just was like, oh my gosh. Because he says, I couldn't say that before because he didn't know anything.
Yeah.
He didn't know anything. And
and I think with the difficult relationship he had with his father, because his father wanted him to be one thing and he wanted to be another thing. Right. I don't know where the father was coming from that. Maybe he just really was thinking it would be the best thing for him whenever. Probably. Sometimes our parents,
they said he
have the American dream.
Yeah.
And he said he was a good junior golfer, though, remember?
Yeah, he said he was good. He actually had some talent.
Yeah.
But I think with not talking about it and having that strained relationship with his father, I think it just disconnected him.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think you're right. And I think that with all of us, learning our family stories, learning where we come from helps us to connect and help us understand. It's like, I think you said before, Melissa,
Anita Hill said, I feel connected.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me.
We've all got those kind of stories in our families, on our trees, that help us. Once we learn the stories, we got people that we don't feel connected to, people that were like, this grandma was crazy, kind of like he was saying, but once we learn their lives and what was going on, instead of, and not just grandma was born here, grandma died here, grandma got married here, and that's all I have.
Well, I want to bring it
story. Yeah, go ahead,
Laura.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Laura.
Go ahead.
So I really, from what people can take away about how they could do their own research, obviously he needed professional help, and I think
Yeah.
You know, you're coming out of exile. Yeah, you need some professional
Oh, yeah.
help. Not in the emotional sense, just with that.
I think after that, they need some of that too. Some of these stories they might need.
A lot of us, even though we've hit a brick wall and we can't identify the names of ancestors. Like, for instance, I have a brick wall in Virginia around 1780. I might not know which Wilkinson in that thing was my ancestor, but I know what county it was. I know what time it was. So I can still try to understand that context without actually knowing the names and the dates.
That's a great point.
And that can connect you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And kind of coming full circle to something that was said at the beginning. And I really credit Mary for saying this, because she talked about our preconceptual ideas of things and our biases of things, which we all have. They're just, I don't know, I think they're innate, or we just pick them up. But she's so right. Mary is so right about that, because in these episodes, it really, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. We've all been doing this for a long, I've been doing it for 33 years. And even though I've been doing it for 33 years, I'm still learning. And I still have to be reminded, like what Mary said. Yeah. You have to check your biases. You have to check your preconceived notions of, you know, you have to look at it with new eyes. I've got this year, I have a presentation that I'm doing that is called Researching Your Boring Ancestors.
I saw that title.
I love it.
And it's true, because I find a lot of genealogists, if they can't find enough records, or if they're just an old dirt farmer, or they didn't really do anything special, they think, oh, that's just a boring ancestor. And I'll admit, I did this too. And you kind of set them aside looking for the interesting ones.
Yeah. Those were the good stories.
They're all interesting.
Because you know what? They all lived on this earth. And, you know, go ahead, Mary.
The other thing that, I mean, our ancestors, the ancestors we are most familiar with, I think, at least in my mind, are our grandparents. Some of us knew great grandparents, but most of us knew our grandparents. And when we knew our grandparents, I mean, you know, they were 70 to 80 years old. And so that's what we think ancestors are. They're we've got still this image.
All these old people.
I'm working on a presentation about recreating their world.
Oh yeah, and I love that.
I mean, one of the things that I'm using in it is just looking in city directories. What kind of things were there?
What could they do?
I found a pool hall with cigars. It was like, okay, he was 21 and he went out with his friends and he probably was drinking
absolutely.
Exactly. And it just gives a whole different impression of our ancestors. They
I love that.
Stodgy 70-years-olds.
Exactly.
Wild oats to sow.
And just like and Mary, I'm right with you with that, and especially the women in our ancestors and our grandmothers, our little grandmothers who never told a lie or would never drink, or didn't do these things. Look at them. Look at their
only
lives.
Had sex 3 times.
Exactly. You know.
Look at this episode.
I found out mine was a hot mess.
Look at this episode as we try to get back to finding your roots, but look at this episode and what Ralph found about his grandmother. He's got 2 lines where he found 3 strong women. He found that his daggone grandmother said, we are escaping Cuba.
And got on that
told her husband, I'm going.
He was over in England or somewhere, wasn't he, at a sugar conference?
And he said that she had tried a couple of times, but it just didn't work out. They kept running into people, but they finally got, it was his grandmother and his father and the brother on the boat and made it through to Miami. And the amazing thing is there is a photo of them coming on the boat. They just happened to get a photo, which I think is really cool. And he had never seen before. How fun is that? As he is grandmother. And he goes, she was the sweetest thing. And I said, you did what? You know? But you got to do what
think
you
about the husband.
Yes.
Knowing that woman, he's over in another country, not another town or state. He's in another country, and then he's got to get out that way.
He had to get out the Spanish. The Spanish helped him to get out.
Helped him.
And how cool is it that they found his congressional record of where he spoke about how he escaped and what was going on in Cuba.
And he heard it in his words. Yeah.
Yeah, he got to read it and hear his grandfather's story firsthand because they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. He didn't know anything.
But you
All
know
he
what?
knew was his mom liked Cuba and said it was like this paradise.
Right.
And his dad would never, ever, ever talk about it. So he's got that very, very strong woman. And then they took his dad's family. Was it his dad's or his mom's family back to Spain? I can't remember. Maybe the mom's family went back to Spain.
No, it was the mother's family that went
the
back.
Mom's.
They have to the Catalonian region of Spain.
The Spain. Okay, thanks. And then what do? She marries a guy that starts a factory. A paper bag.
That's right.
Don't forget that.
Yeah. And he's like, I thought paper bags were always here, but I guess somebody has to create them. So they've got this really big, huge business.
Yeah.
And her husband dies. And in a time period where women didn't own things, they didn't take over things.
1900.
He's got a
It was July 1900.
Yeah. So she takes it over and runs this and builds this business. So there's another strong woman.
She built that business for her and her boy.
And her boys.
Right.
But then her one boy that she wanted to take over didn't want to take over because he was listed in the 1906 Spanish census as being a Bohemian.
Like that's a bad thing.
Yeah. I know, but it's really funny. So he's going, this is where I got it from. I never knew where I got my artsy side from, you know? And apparently his grandmother used to call him whatever Bohemian would be in Spanish, but he says she'd always just go,
So, do you remember the advice? Was it the grandmother that gave him the advice or grandfather that told Raul to do what he's good at? What was that?
Do what he's good at. His father, I think it was his father, or maybe it was his grandfather, told him to do what he was good at, which, most parents don't tell their kids to go into acting today.
Correct.
Yeah, they don't
and it was acting for him. Yeah.
It was acting for him. So I thought that was really great. But what I thought was even funnier is he did eventually go back. He eventually got married and had a child. So then he went back and he took over his family's. I guess he quit the Bohemian lifestyle. I don't know. And he went back to the factory. But the story in there.
Migrated to Cuba, though.
Well, eventually, yes, you're right. And then
not that long later.
He did go back and he ran the factory for a while. And then, then he immigrated to Cuba. But what I thought was, so that's how that part of his family got to Cuba. But what I thought was really, really funny is when they showed him, but wait, that's not all. And showed them with the factory. It's still there. They sell to like 50 different countries. It's a huge factory that family members still run. How amazing is that? And he never knew his family made paper bags.
I love it.
Great episodes.
Yeah, all three were great episodes. And I really do think that sometimes I like to watch them sometimes the first time around just to get the stories, just to see what's going to happen. Yeah, and then I'll watch it again. And then I'll especially because we're going to talk about them. So, but I will watch them the second time because I want to see what records that they've used. And I know Melissa has encouraged us every time we could talk about finding your roots is to watch those credits when they go up at the end. Yeah. Because they will tell you
the repository, they list the archives, the libraries that they use. Yeah. And and it may be that it's not, I don't know. I just feel like that you should write them down because you never know if it's one that you need to go look at for something.
Exactly. Absolutely. Or it might trigger your brain for something around you that you had never thought of because records can be found in the strangest places. And some of these records they were using for the factory, they were using those factory records. They were using books that were written on that time period in the building of that factory. So they were thinking out of the box and not just family records. They were researching and the records of the factory, which sometimes I think we forget. Especially when our ancestors own a business, we forget, oh, we can research in there and we might be able to find some really good stuff. So anyway,
so occupations are critical as well.
Right.
Thinking about, what can we find out? Somebody just did a presentation, I want to say on legacy in the last few months, was about occupations or something like that.
Very important. Very, very important.
Very important to be able to look at that angle, especially if you got a trade that, your brick masons, your carpenters, your bag makers or whatever.
Your bag makers, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anything else from these 3 episodes that you don't feel like I loved everybody's comments there, all your comments. Thank you so much. And I love the guests' comments and how they always come out at the end just feeling grounded and connected, even if they get some stories that are not the best. They come out feeling connected. So anyway,
how much we don't know.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for watching this episode of GenFriends. And we will continue watching Finding Your Roots for season 8, and come back and tell you our thoughts. And we're hoping that we'll get some comments from you about the things that you're learning as you watch, because then you'll help us learn. Because we'll see what you're picking out. So we're all in this to help each other. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next time on GenFriends. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.